The world faces a lot of severe issues, global issues. And for these issues to be addressed, nations are going to have to cooperate, which hasn't been happening so much, especially in terms of climate change and so on. The cooperation has not been great so far. Before nations can cooperate, they have to commit to the idea. And before they're going to do that, democratic nations are going to need their populations to commit. But if more immediate problems are on the minds of the voters, they're going to vote their pocketbooks. Consider Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Before you can get to any of the higher levels of needs, the bottom needs must be met. So things like employment and income are very low. They're in the safety layer. And if the population in large segments feel that their employment is threatened, that their ability to have housing is threatened, that is going to take precedence over almost anything else. And until those needs are met, or at least those fears mitigated, then nations are not going to commit to anything that's further out into the future, even if they are safety issues. So what should our government do? What steps should it take? And given all the problems we have, where do we start? Well, what's the purpose of government? According to the Constitution, the purpose of our federal government is to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. So how are we doing? Congress has a nearly 70% disapproval rate. Income inequality is worse now than it's been since 1929, the end of the Gilded Age. In fact, it may be worse than ever. The American population is more politically polarized than it's been in recent memory. But how many of our divisions are grounded in obsolete beliefs and ideas? It wouldn't make much sense to argue over how to design a road based on how well a horse-drawn carriage could navigate it. And yet it seems like many of the most divisive political issues echo back to a bygone era. Today's economy and the way government interacts with it is far different than it was in the 1950s, and certainly way different than it was at the founding of our country. Let's take a look at how our system works now using a simple analogy. All right, let's suppose for a minute that the United States, USA, is an island surrounded by water. And on the island, there is Fred, and he has $100. We also have Betty, and she has $100. Well, let's say this is Wilma. And over here, we'll have Betty, and she has $100. Now, the total amount of money on the entire island and the entire population is $300. Our population consists entirely of Fred, Wilma, and Betty. I guess it's pretty good for Fred. He should be smiling. All right, so let's say that Wilma works real hard and she makes a hammock, and Fred says, oh, I'd like to have that hammock. So he pays $5 to Wilma for the hammock. And so now he's got 95 and Wilma has 105. Total amount still the same, $300. Now let's suppose that Betty has some shells, and Wilma, with her newfound wealth, pays $5 for shells. And so now she has 100 and Betty has 105. Again, the total amount of money has not changed. It is still exactly $300. No one can make more money. They can work hard and make things, but they're only trading around the money that already exists because none of them are allowed to print their own money. They don't have a printing press. They can't mint coins, and that's not allowed. Now, let's suppose that a boat shows up, and in the boat is a very strange guy and his name is Mork. And he's not from the United States. He's from somewhere else. And what he's got are fish. So he says, would you like to buy some fish? And for whatever reason, he would like to have some of these dollars. I guess he believes in this island, the USA, and he thinks that these dollars are good to hold on to. So he is offering some fresh caught fish, and Betty buys $5 worth of fish. Right? And Fred buys $5 worth of fish. So Fred now has $90, and Wilma now has $100. I mean, Betty now has $100, and Mork did have 0, but now he's got 10. Now, before he leaves, he needs supplies, and so he offers $1 for supplies and to Fred, and so Fred's now got 91, and Mork has 9, and he does the same thing with Betty, $1 for supplies. And so she has 101, and now he's got 8. So the total amount of money, as long as Mork is still here trading, total amount of money has not changed. It's still $300. But Mork doesn't live here. He is a foreigner. So what he has done is he has brought in what we call imports. So Fred and Betty imported fish and in exchange gave him money, and they exported supplies. But they were running a trade deficit. The USA is running a trade deficit because Mork is leaving with $8. That $8 is missing. And so once he's gone, the total amount of money that's circulating is now $292 because the $8 is gone. Of course, presumably he may come back and buy something else, but the way things go, if he keeps coming back and selling stuff, he's going to keep draining the money. And since there is no one here who can create new money, the money supply will continue to drop on the island because it's a closed system. So the obvious question is, where did the money come from in the first place? Money has to come from somewhere else. And if any new money is to come into the system, it has to come from outside. And the place that comes from is the federal government. When I tell people that the federal government creates money, many seem surprised. Many don't believe it, although it's pretty obvious. All you have to do is take out a dollar bill and look at who signs it. But people will say, well, doesn't the private sector provide the government with money? No, it's the other way around. The government created money in the first place. So if we go back to the island analogy, the government created the money so that the islanders could use it. Or government created money so that we can use it. It's what monetizes the economy. Now people say, well, wait a minute, what about banks and the multiplier effect? Well, first of all, banks are licensed by the federal government, but let's take a look at that. Okay, let's go back to our island here and let's have a bank. Let's create a bank. I guess it'll be a bank made out of straw. Bank. Let's go back to total amount of cash of 100 each. Keep it simple. The total amount of $300, except, no, let's add the bank now. Assets and liabilities and net worth. So let's start off with this bank. Let's say that this bank has a little bit of cash on hand. Let's say it has $10. Let's say that it owns the hut, and so that's worth $100. And so its retained earnings, or net worth, is $110, and that's all it has. Now, Fred would like to borrow some money, and the bank looks at Fred and say, hey, this is a stand-up guy. Let's loan him the money he wants. And so it approves a loan to Fred, and so we're gonna do a loan to Fred of $100. So on the bank's balance sheet is now going to have assets of $100. That's the loan that Fred owes them, and they are going to put $100 into Fred's checking account. Now note, They have just created $100 out of nothing, ex nihilo. There was not $100 before, but there is $100 now, which Fred can now use in his checking account. So he's now got $200, but he also owes them $100. So even though there's $100 he can use now, he needs to pay it back in the future. He can use it right now. He can give $50 to Wilma and $50 to Betty for whatever. And in terms of the banking system, which is only, let's just say this is the banking system of the USA island here, it's just going to move to their checking accounts. In terms of the bank, it's still going to be $100 in checking accounts and $100 owed to them. Now, eventually, Fred's going to use the money to do whatever he does with it, and he's going to have to pay it back. And when he pays it back, then the debt is eliminated. So that he's going to pay back, say he pays back $101 for, $1 interest. And so that $100 goes. So the bank created that $100, and once it's paid back, it no longer exists. Now they're going to have now $11 in cash and $111 in retained earnings, and Fred is going to be back to $99. Okay, so yes, banks do create money. They create credit money. And actually, most money in the economy is credit money created by banks in exactly this way. But the point to remember is that it always nets to zero. So that when a bank makes a loan, or if you use your credit card to buy something, the bank is effectively giving you a loan, and at that moment is creating new money, but you must pay it back, plus interest. So while if you buy something for $100, temporarily there will be $100 new in the economy, but when you pay it back, that $100 disappears. So there's money constantly being pumped into the economy and being pulled back out through the process of bank lending. Now, unfortunately, banks tend to lend more in economic booms. And so when the economy is doing well, the banks feel more relaxed. They feel things are going well, and they tend to lend more money, which makes the boom go even more, creates even better times because people are purchasing more. But then when there's a downturn, banks are less inclined to lend money, and the money supply starts to shrink, which aggravates the recession.